Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Wisdom from the Wound, sponsored by the Initiative for Restorative Justice and Healing. This initiative was launched in September at the University of St. Thomas Law School, and the initiative has a threefold focus to name and address harm from institutional and leadership failures, racial justice, and societal polarization, the goal of which is to promote healing and understanding in these areas. My name is Jim Richter, and I serve as a member of the advisory board for the initiative. I will be your moderator for today's panel discussion, and I appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with all of you. I have been organizing, facilitating, and empowering survivors through small group work and peer-to-peer support over the last decade. I'd like to start with a few opening remarks, introduce our panelists today, and review some of the terms and definitions so that we're all on the same virtual page for today's webinar. We're going to use most of our time together to hear from our distinguished panelists and then open the discussion to audience questions and comments. I do encourage you to go ahead and use the chat if you'd like, as well as the question and answer, and I will certainly do my best to moderate and curate that as we go along. Your questions are welcomed at any time. We will, and then I want to let you know that we will conclude promptly at the end of the 90 minutes. Today, we're also proud to partner with Awake Milwaukee, who is a co-sponsor of this event. Awake Milwaukee is a grassroots Catholic nonprofit organization whose mission is to awaken the community to the full reality of sexual abuse within the Catholic Church and to work for transformation and healing. Awake invites you to sign their open letter to survivors, learn more about their online survivor circles, or join an upcoming webinar on why church needs survivor stories. And information on all of this is available on their website at awakemilwaukee.org. The purpose of today's conversation is to acknowledge and discuss the harm caused by the sexual abuse of children and those generally who have been harmed. This includes physical, spiritual, and emotional or psychological abuse, as well as neglect and abandonment, and even financial abuse. I'd like to start with an operational definition of restorative justice and provide a framework for understanding and applying restorative justice efforts to those or for those who have been abused. We'll discuss the challenges and opportunities when adapting restorative justice practices outside of the criminal justice system where they are most often associated. Our panelists will share their experiences on restorative justice from a somewhat Catholic perspective and lessons learned and shared while working with victim survivors. Throughout today's webinar, I will use the term victim, survivor, and harmed somewhat interchangeably, but always to mean someone who has been harmed by another person in a serious, grievous, or impactful way. Today's panelists have had their lives, and in some cases, their entire career, formed or transformed by the clergy sexual abuse crisis. They share their perspectives as victim survivors or secondary victims, advocates for those harmed, and concerned members of the flock. I'd like to introduce to you today Barbara Thorpe. Barbara joins us today from Boston, where she spent most of her career with the Archdiocese of Boston. During her tenure, she directed the outreach to clergy sexual abuse survivor programs and their families as part of the crisis response, which began in 2002. Barbara was instrumental in coordinating the meeting between abuse survivors and Pope Benedict in April of 2008 in Washington, D.C., and she's also assisted with the apostolic visitation to Dublin, Ireland in 2010, again facilitating survivor meetings. Barbara, thank you for joining us. Anne-Marie Hanson is a licensed assisted living director who founded and leads several long-term care facilities in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. Her career in long-term care spans over 28 years as the director of other metro area care centers and home care services. She has a strong background in aging adult care and palliative care with a special focus on dementia care and healthcare business administration. Her dedication to contributing to the field of memory loss and senior care comes from a very personal experience, and she instills that commitment into each employee working with her in order to provide unique, individualized care that preserves the dignity of each resident while providing for their medical, social, and spiritual needs. Anne-Marie, thank you for joining us today. Tom Thorpe has served as the director of the Office of Assistance Ministry for the Archdiocese of Chicago for the last 10 years. During that time, what matters to him most is that he's been able to be present for many victim survivors of childhood sexual abuse during their journey toward healing. He has listened as they have spoke aloud their painful memories. Tom has supported them and their families through a broad array of resources, including therapy, substance abuse treatment, and spiritual direction. With some, he has had the honor of bearing witness as they took the courageous step of sharing their experiences with Cardinal Cupich or Cardinal George. Tom has worked collaboratively with victim survivors, clergy, and staff to establish and develop a healing garden next to the Holy Family Parish in Chicago. This is a beautiful and sacred space for victim survivors and their families, really all who have been affected by abuse. And Tom feels that there is power in having a public, physical commemoration of the journey from darkness into sunlight, where there is growth, healing, and blooming. Thank you, Tom, for being with us today. And our fourth panelist is Frank Muirs. Frank is the Minnesota director of the Survivor Network of Those Abused by Priests, or SNAP, and is actively involved with the Diocese of St. Paul in Minneapolis, among others, to promote healing efforts from the crisis. Frank is a frequent speaker on the topic of sexual abuse, its effects, ways to heal, and often remarks about the difference that he makes between victims and survivors. Frank has taken part in healing circles and the promotion of restorative justice initiatives within the Diocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, and he has been a featured speaker at symposia and other meetings in the region on restorative justice. To all four of our panels, thank you so much for taking time to be with us today.
Thanks, Jim.
Sure. For our audience, the notion of restorative justice comes from the peace circles and the practices of Indigenous and First Nation peoples. Some of these practices have been adopted by the fields of victimology and criminology. In its most authentic form, restorative justice programs involve victims or those harmed, offenders, affected members of the community, and often mediators or facilitators to address and repair the harm that was caused by the criminal behavior. This is best accomplished when those involved cooperate and decide how this should be done. The goal is to acknowledge the harm that was experienced by the victim, have the offender address and acknowledge the harm, and be held accountable. And then together repair the harm by way of apology, restitution, or changed behavior. Put another way, the victim talks about how they were harmed, the offender acknowledges that they did the harming, and together they figure out what healing or repairing harm looks like. For many victims of clergy sex abuse, this model is not possible, where you would have the victim and the offender together. And there are any number of reasons for this. Instead, peace circles or facilitated conversations using restorative justice principles adapted to the circumstances, these can be coordinated between victim survivors, the representatives of offenders, and mediators or facilitators. As I mentioned earlier, those who are in community with victims and offenders are also impacted by the harm, and they also have an important role in this work. I think that is well represented by today's audience. The goals for the victim remain the same: to receive an apology which acknowledges the harm, and then to be able to direct their questions and concerns to someone who can respond in a genuine and compassionate and human manner while they process that experience. Another adaptation of peace circles are facilitated groups where survivors, friends, family, loved ones, sometimes referred to as secondary victims, can be with one another in a safe, supportive, and respectful space in which to talk about, process, and again, explore the feelings from their abuse. That is the conclusion of the introduction. I hope we're all on the same virtual page. I do welcome your questions and comments from the audience. Please go ahead and use the Q&A for that. And panelists, let's go ahead and jump right in. What happens when restorative justice is done well?
Well, I could probably speak to that a little bit. A couple things come to mind. When I first started working with this many years ago, we pretty much had an adversarial relationship set up between the survivors, which we had at that time. Nobody used the word survivor. We were victims, and the church, the diocese, whatever, they were the enemy, and they pretty much saw us that way as well. It was back in 2015 that I approached one of the director of ministerial standards here in St. Paul, Minneapolis, and he approached me as well and wondered if there's something we could do to work together. So if restorative justice is done well, it perhaps could negate this adversarial relationship between the two entities. And it doesn't have to be a person and a person. It can be a construct, a diocese, a church, a parish, whatever. But to remove that, once you get beyond that I don't like you, you don't like me, that's the way it is, we can maybe move on. Okay. And the second thing I think of is it helps us as people, as institutions, move from the victims, and let's face it, both sides see themselves as the victim. They move from victim to survivor. And in many of our people still use the word victim to tell us where they are. So we're looking to move them along. And that's all if you have a victim / survivor, but let's move on a little bit from there. So if it's successful, I would say those two things would be something you could point to.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. Other thoughts on what happens when restorative justice is done well, or what it looks like when it is done well? Barbara.
Well, one of the things that strikes me, Jim, and all of our people who are listening today is that the silencing of voices is very profound, especially for people who have been abused as children, and the enduring impact of that well into adulthood. And so one of the things that really is so important, I think, about the opportunities for restorative justice is giving voice, is that having that opportunity for the survivor to finally be truly listened to, be truly treated with dignity, and to have their voices listened to with deep respect and deep care.
Thank you, Barbara. And I think that notion of being heard is really important for victim survivors. Thank you for making that point.
Just to add to that, I'm coming more today from a place of the survivor than working in a professional manner. But that's also a really hard thing to grapple with when you've been silenced for so many years, and all of a sudden you supposedly have a voice, but yet you're still a problem. So it's a nuanced kind of position as well. And then from a professional point of view, I was just thinking of this as we're talking this morning, is I've cared for people who have been abused and have turned to alcohol or drugs, which has then induced some kind of memory loss, and then just what care looks like for them down the road too. So this is a trajectory of harm that normally stays with the person throughout their life experience. And I've seen it on that hospice, end of life care kind of side as well.
You know, the only thing I would add to what's been said is that when I have that initial meeting with a victim survivor, when they're actually ready to come forward and begin to tell their story, I try to remind myself, this is the critical moment. this is a moment where things can either be a start towards some healing, or it can affirm their worst fears about ever coming forward.
Mhm, mhm.
And to me, that's the narrative I carry with me in terms of this restorative justice model, is the healing, the repairing the harm can happen in that moment. It may take many, 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 many years, but that moment is critical to me.
And I think too, one of the things that happens is many survivors are dealing with the legal system, and it can be either criminally, civilly, or canonically. And all of those elements none of them are really designed, and none of them are really good fit for the needs of survivors. And the restorative justice kind of principles really are not the primary aspect of any of those dimensions of the traditional kind of containers of law or means for justice, and often lead to more harm and more frustration. And of course, many survivors have the particular challenge of having to deal with all three of those elements, even sometimes at the same time. And it's just very challenging.
Almost without exception, when I've dealt with survivors, they will tell you that the abuse they received after they told, after they came forth, after they reached out to their church or whomever, was worse than the original abuse, because it builds up your hope and then crushes you to death. And that's when it's an article of despair rather than hope. That's why I think I referred to the adversarial thing. If you can quit being enemies and start working for the same goal, which it should be the same goal, that's what we should be at.
Frank and Barbara, I think those last 2 points that you made are really worth kind of reiterating. Barbara acknowledging that when someone is, after perhaps years or decades, kind of ready to engage, ready to kind of admit what had happened. As Frank said, sometimes that initial response by, if you will, the church, is really heavy-handed. But as you said, it's also challenging because there is a kind of a canonical path. There can be a kind of a legal path. And I think in my own experience, as you pointed out, one of the values of restorative justice is it kind of acknowledges those things, but it doesn't depend on those things in order to engage.
Right.
It reminds me actually of another question, which I think we've kind of touched upon, which is, Frank, what is there to be afraid of when a victim makes a statement, a claim, if you will? And again, I don't mean a legal claim. They tell their story. What is the danger there? Or what is
obviously the danger of negating them, of making them invalid, of making them less than humans. Just saying, anytime somebody comes to you and says, "I'm hurt," and you say, "Get over it," or "No, you're not," in one form or the other, you have crushed that person. And you can think of somebody coming to your door and saying, "I've been in a car accident and it's out here on the street." What would you say? "Get over it?" Or, "Yeah, well, fine. You should talk to somebody about." Your first response is always, "What can I do? What can I do? Oh my God." Well, first off, you might want to empathetically say, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry that happened."
Yeah.
And secondly, what can I do?
Just a point of clarification, and thanks for the participant who asked, what do you mean when you say that someone is involved with the legal system canonically? And what we're simply referring to that is there is the legal system, and then there is canon law. And there are prescriptions within canon law to address some kinds of actions. But again, that would be separate, for example, from legal proceedings. That would be separate from even sometimes just working with or helping a victim survivor to identify resources. Would anyone like to add to that? Okay. Well, let me ask the flip question. what isn't restorative justice? What is it not?
Well, I've thought about that a lot. I think from just listening to other people talk about it, I think I'm getting the impression that a lot of people think it's a one-time fix. You go there, you go through it, all fixed. They put the cast on, your arm's better. This could go on for decades. It could go on for forever, and it's not always successful. So I think we have to look at it as it's not a way to get even. Boy, I'm going to take care of those people. I don't think it's a cure-all, and it certainly is not a quick solution. And one further point, perhaps it can't be mandated. Somebody says, we order you to go to this. Okay, I'll get through with this, and then it's over. So those are things that come to mind for me right away.
Frank, that is a really excellent point. Restorative justice is an engagement of several parties who agree to have a conversation and then use a process to come to a solution. And I think one of the most familiar or common reasons that I have heard in which why for example, a restorative justice would not work between a priest and a victim is that often that willingness is not there. And as you said, it is not possible to enter into this kind of work with either a notion of retribution, I'm going to get that person, or without a full willingness to kind of explore the what and the why and the how, and kind of do what I would think of as authentic work. Tom, what's your thought?
Well, I have to qualify this and say I'm coming from years ago when I first got out of college. I worked in a mediation center, so that was my first exposure to restorative justice. So, and it was specifically with cases where the courts said, you two have some kind of history together. Why don't you see if you can resolve it? And so it would be sent to mediation, and we'd have mediators who would try to resolve the case. And if it was resolved, then the courts would kind of accept the agreement. But these were between neighbors, friends, people. It was smaller cases. But what it showed me was, one, any kind of mediation or process like this is dependent on good faith. So both parties have to be willing to enter the conversation with a willingness to possibly reach some kind of agreement. And then you're moving away from a win-lose to a win-win. There was a book years ago called Getting to Yes, and the whole idea was trying to seek out needs and interests. And so I think sometimes the dilemma with this particular topic is the needs and interests of both sides may be very different. There are many victim survivors I've worked with who've said, I really do want that apology. I really want to hear the words from the leader of this diocese that they get it, that they feel something, or I want them to make a change. And that may be very different from a lawyer's agenda representing them, which may be, you need or want this. So it becomes a little complicated in that regard. But I do think the win-lose model, the adversarial model, doesn't really come together with restorative justice.
And Barbara, given your
I kind of agree more with what Tom and the others have been speaking to. I have often seen that the legal process often precludes the direct interaction of the survivors and church representatives, bishops, clergy. And often if say the survivor might be pursuing a legal claim, the lawyers representing them say they can't engage directly with representatives of the church, and vice versa. The lawyers representing the church are telling them, no, you cannot meet directly with survivors or have direct communication. Very early on, as the crisis was exploding in Boston, that issue became like really very intense. And Fortunately, we made a decision, this was quite early, I'd say by May of 2002, that it was critically important that survivors have direct opportunity for meetings with the bishop and with clergy, even if they were pursuing legal claims. And I think the fact that that had not happened before, that the legal management of so-called cases had really disrupted the opportunities for direct understanding even by church people of the suffering of survivors and for their families to communicate. It had been managed in a sense by legal representatives. And I just witnessed just incredible things happen when, in a sense, the so-called people who were the legal people or others who were trying to manage it got out of the way and just let the principals, in a sense, the harmed, the survivors, and those who had, if not perpetrated the harm, had enabled it. And to be able to have a really important encounter and conversation. As many of you know, the crisis in Boston erupted on January 6th, which was the Epiphany. And that epiphany, in a sense, that light, I always thought it was interesting that the Globe story has referred to as the spotlight team. And indeed it was a spotlight being shown on a terrible, terrible, grievous harm. And it needed to be brought into the light. But that opportunity really allowed for remarkable encounters between survivors and bishops and clergy and others who needed to hear in person, in their presence, the depth of the harm and an opportunity to apologize and to ask the person what they needed to heal.
I'd like to caution, though, that the apology itself is nice, but that's not enough. And in many cases, a lot of the people that I deal with will tell you that they got an email or something saying, sorry about that. That's not enough. There's got to be a follow-up. There's got to be more to that. And I've been asked, what would you do? I said, perhaps the bishop could go out and knock on their door and say, I've come to apologize. Would that have more effect on them than an email? Oh my God, it would blow them away. Well, but I was told, oh, you can't do that. Sure you can. It's going to take a long time, but so.
And what I'm hearing, I'm sorry, go ahead, Emery.
Just to comment on that again as a survivor and just having gone through this in our archdiocese and having been at the meetings, Restorative Justice, when Ramsey County, when we were closing, I was at those in attendance when our bishop got up and apologized. I was also one of those who went, and he, for several years, he kept his Friday afternoons open for survivors to just sit with him. And I did that a lot. I just, you could call him up. He said, yep, show up. And it's helpful because you're being heard. And he's good about understanding and compassion. But I agree with Frank that even though it's healthy because it's for more of the institutional church, it's a false apology in a way because our archbishop didn't harm me, nor was he the archbishop here when this harm happened. However, it mimics something that in a psychological and emotional healing is helpful. It kind of helps bridge some spaces for healing. And that's where I've seen the restorative justice, which at first I'm like, I don't get what this is about as a survivor in a really raw place. And Jim knows that when I started. And so this is restorative justice is nuanced. And it's a journey. It's like you start and it's a journey and a path throughout your life in some ways as you're triggered by different events. So I just wanted to add that a little bit from my perspective.
So there's a
Thank you so much.
Too, though, that the fact that indicates then that I'm ready, you come to me. I remember the bishop of the Jesuit bishop, the Oregon province, said he was ordered to go up to Alaska and apologize to all these people. They had abused these kids by the hundreds. And he went out, got fully vested, and got up in church and stood up on a platform and said, if you come, I will lay hands on you and we can forgive each other. And no one showed up. Isn't that amazing?
I think sorry, Frank, to interrupt, but I think what I am hearing is that there are different processes, some of which are, kind of diocese or church based. Some of them are based within the legal system. Restorative justice might be a third area where, again, work can be done. And what I'm hearing from you, from our panelists, is that one or two or multiple may be, that a victim may be engaged with more than one at any given time, and that that there are differences in terms of the outcome that's expected. Am I hearing that correctly? And so I think it's really useful for our audience, based again on the experiences of our distinguished panelists, to recognize that there is a paradigm shift in which restorative justice provides an opportunity for conversation, for reconciliation, that is different from some of the other practices that we've had. And I'd like to just share a comment made by Father Dan Griffith, who we'll talk about in a bit, who comments that the legal process can no longer be the tail that wags the dog in these cases, that too much harm has been done to victim survivors for too long, and that a paradigm shift that is consistent with the gospel is long overdue. And that the consistency with the gospel is the notion of restorative justice and the application in a really gospel-focused way. That's what I'm hearing. Father Dan, thank you for your comment. And also, again, thank you for I think really kind of, if you will, kicking the door open on the options and opportunities that are available to. Again, really, we're talking about victim-centered work, but of course, these would also be available to members of the community, and to some degree, these would be available to offenders as well. Okay. All right. Well, I have a question from the audience. Can you address if or how restorative justice is potentially not safe?
I can offer a thought on that, which is I have heard that there are people where there's situations where a victim survivor wants to meet with the offender, with the actual priest that perpetrated them, or whether they're still a priest or not a priest. And I just personally think that would be a real vulnerable and maybe even dangerous thing to do. I mean, I think that would be one of those areas where I would think very long and hard before suggesting that someone consider that, whether they would consider using restorative justice in that way.
Yeah, thank you, Tom.
I think there would be a danger of not having someone in there to moderate a little bit. You'd have to have someone with some knowledge of the situation that could keep it moving or stopping it or question. You could be awfully vulnerable going into one of those meetings.
Definitely correct.
Come out way more harm.
Yeah, and so
neither party wish that.
Yeah, those are great points, and I want thank you, Whitney, for the question. I would also like to say that I think that there are different risks, or if you will, there's a different safety risk if you are talking about a restorative justice engagement or a restorative justice process in which an offender is present, or whether or not there is a representative for the offender, or in the case of some groups, there's no representative at all. There is simply again, kind of a peer-to-peer discussion about kind of what happened and how you feel about that. So I would just suggest that there are probably different levels of safety risk depending on who the participants are. And that's what I heard from both Tom and Frank as well.
just to add to that, Jim, I think, I heard that comment before about, the role of the lawyers, but I think it's important to remember that for many victim survivors, if they don't have a lawyer to represent them, going in on their own to the church and speaking, there's situations where I know in Chicago where the lawyers want the victims to be able to be represented fully so that they're not coming in and there is no misrepresentation or confusion about the conversation. So I think it's dangerous, I think, to start getting into splitting these different things off, because I do think there is a role for lawyers to represent the victim survivors to protect them and to protect their interests.
Mhm.
Thank you. A comment that I also heard, and both in the chat as well as in the questions, this kind of point is coming up about who should that spokesperson be if it's not the offender. So again, oftentimes in diocesan life, it will be the bishop or the archbishop. Anne-Marie, you mentioned in your own story that it was Archbishop Bernard Hebda with whom you engaged. That you have had conversations, that you have kind of been working with, and I know that there was quite a while when those Friday afternoons were open to victim survivor appointments, to drop-ins, exactly so that there could be kind of a one-to-one. I think there can always be a risk of insincerity or kind of confused obligation when there's a representative. But as I said from the onset, there are circumstances under which involvement of the offender is simply not possible, would be unwise, or to the earlier point, would be very unsafe and not recommended. But that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be another opportunity or another way for someone who is harmed to be able to share and to be ministered to.
You have a good point. And I think there's many survivors of abuse that the priest or clergy or the teachers, and for me, also teachers in a private school, some are not alive. And so you will never have the opportunity to be in front of them.
Yes.
And so that's a real reality for my understanding, a majority of survivors. Also, the hard thing with the legal, it's civil only, it's not criminal for many. And so, because there's a statute of limitations. And so that's a hard pill to swallow as a victim who has to live with the consequences of the abuse day in and day out in every aspect of your life. So I feel in many ways too little too late, but I decided that if I had freedom and I wanted to heal and be able to live more fully in the world, if the bishop opened his doors, then it was for me to step up and say, I'm going to show up. And they were ugly. Those were not pretty meetings. I'm angry, but he would talk it through and listen. He'd call and check up on me. And so a relationship has formed, a healthy relationship. And so I think sometimes what we go in as survivors and expect to happen isn't really maybe what is. I know through therapy and working that through, I realized the gift of that time. And also my ability to kind of work through my issues with clergy or people in authority in those meetings. So sometimes what you're going to get out of that in the restorative justice kind of context at this webinar is maybe something different than you expect. You also, my anger isn't at Hebda. You gotta channel it correctly, right? And so they're just somebody who's a conduit really for you to be able to express, voice, be heard, knowing that person didn't harm you. So because I'm in a leadership role in my life, I can step into the Hebda shoes easily, sometimes maybe overly much. But I think also there's I think good therapy, and I've had some incredible therapists in my life. It has been a critical component of restorative justice, integrating it into my life and how I want to live differently. And so I think that's probably what I would like to say there.
Yeah, Anne-Marie, thank you very much for, again, framing that from a very victim-centered approach. because as we as a panel agreed, we were really going to take a victim and survivor centered intention with today's conversation, recognizing that there are so many involved that we cannot control or that we can't really speak for. So thank you for bringing that back. And did I see, was there something, Tom, did you want to make a comment? Or, oh, sorry, Anne-Marie, go ahead.
There's one thing I do want to say, because I didn't realize that this was sponsored by the awakemilwaukee.org. And so that really was a trigger for me this morning when that came up. And because one of the priests who views me in a diocese in here in Minnesota was from the Diocese of Milwaukee, and how I was treated by the Diocese of Milwaukee in this whole process was horrible, was quite horrible, and was very triggering in regards to that priest. So, and so it's a little example of, even in, we're sitting here in restorative justice with these wonderful people, that little thing, I'm like, what the heck, I could go on and on. So maybe that just, if some of you who are on this who are not victim survivors, maybe that's a little tidbit into our lives of, whoa, that's a good organization, probably no harm, probably really great, and they're sponsoring this. But for me as a survivor and my history, that was a difficult thing to see. There's a minute I'm like, I'm off this call. What am I want to be on? So that's
Sure.
those are initial, and then we got to work it through, right? We have to work those things through.
Thanks for sharing that. And also let me just make mention, if I could, about Awake Milwaukee, which in large part was, I think, formed, Anne-Marie, in response to exactly the kind of scenario that you just described by other people of goodwill who agree that that is not appropriate, that is not right, and that kind of a response, the tone of that response should not be tolerated. And let me also just give a personal shout out to Sarah Larson, who is the lead and organizer for Awake, who is not only a remarkable human being, but incredibly passionate and really dedicated to their work. So thanks for sharing that. There's a question from Guy who says, isn't the definition of restorative justice in the eye of the victim survivor? Would anybody like to respond to that? So isn't the definition of restorative justice in the eye of the victim survivor? Barbara.
Yeah, I think so, because that's the center of the harm, right? That's the person who has been harmed, and that's where it begins for that person to really begin to identify what they need to address the suffering, the pain, and it may be over decades that harm has led to in their lives. So yes, I think that has to be the start point of that really deep listening that we're called to in any restorative justice process.
Yeah,
I think it has to be fairly mutual, because you're looking at, number one, what was the harm? And I can see my harm completely different than they might see my harm. As a matter of fact, they told me it wasn't a big deal. I thought it was. Secondly, who was harmed? And this bothered me because, again, I was the one harmed. I'm the only one harmed. They were harmed as well. And until they realized that their entire body of Christ, that their entire church was harmed by this perpetrator, just the same as I was, they're just not focused on it. And thirdly, what can we do about it? And we have to now come up with some sort of a solution. It's not totally solution, maybe, but it's got to be, what are we going to do next? How? And I think, again, you'd have to have both people, both sides input to that. I might say, well, I want you to do this. And they say, we can't do that. And they've told us repeatedly, we're legally bound not to do that kind of thing. So there would be almost a negotiation there, but in good faith. And therefore, it should lead to some conclusion or a healing. And that, again, has to be on both sides. To think that a victim can heal and the church goes right on is I'm sorry, that's silly. Just doesn't fit.
And just to come off what you said, Frank, is the church has always taught this, and I think this scandal in the church has shown there is no sin committed in secret. it's like that ripple effect, right? And so there are so many that are harmed by this, and it continues. The amount of people harmed as stories came out over in these dioceses and people read about them, that continues to harm people, right? So there, and this I think is what troubles me, is that there's the sense among a lot of people it's behind us now. And we don't want to talk about it anymore. We want to sweep it under the rug. And it's kind of like the legal part is behind us. But there is a significant, I don't even know if we've begun to understand the deeper level of healing and work. And I think that's where restorative justice is one of those avenues, maybe, of starting that process within the church on a large scale.
I would just add to that, Anne-Marie, that you had mentioned that the legal process is over for many people. For some though, who are pursuing the legal process through the church's canonical courts and appeals, that process can go on for decades. And it is one of the ways that, in a sense, people, sort of that idea of institutional abuse, Frank had mentioned earlier that some of the most painful things that happened was how the response was or wasn't. But I think one of the ways that people are that silencing goes on is to be ignored, is to not have any response. That is a profound silencing if you reach out and you receive simply silence, no response. And that, unfortunately, for many who've participated in the canonical process have been deeply disappointed and further harmed by the length of time. I have a survivor I've worked with who, after 20 years of pursuing the case canonically, finally there was a conclusion, and the priest died a couple months later. But he had remained, he was on administrative leave that entire process. But it was an entire, really, almost another lifetime had gone by for that survivor. Almost an entire another childhood had gone by, if you think of that as, 18 years or 20 years. And that to have restorative justice be an anchor principle for the church's own canonical process would be remarkable. It would be just an extraordinary breakthrough to have it be truly transparent, be truly seeking restorative justice in the very best sense.
And Barbara, that's a reminder as well that restorative justice practices can be, supplementary or adjunctive, and in some cases, the most kind of readily available, meaning the most immediate, for some folks when you are describing these, the slow walking or the long and painful process, or the, the really what feels sometimes to be this kind of merciless waiting that victims often have.
Right.
And this often, of course, comes at the conclusion of, again, years and years of silence.
That's right.
And so there's, again, if that acknowledgement, if that truth has been shared, then there is at least a willingness to begin that process or to talk about it.
Right.
Again, however tentatively. Thanks for that reminder. There is a question from Sarah Larson of Awake Milwaukee. Sarah asks, could any of the panelists speak to a distinction between restorative justice and transitional justice? And I will admit, Sarah, I am not familiar with transitional justice, but if anyone on our panel is and would like to speak to it, we'd welcome your comment.
Well, I think restorative justice is transitional. It's moving from one place to another almost by definition. So little bit of misnomer on the restorative, to restore is not necessarily to put back the way it was before anything happened. but it does at least build something and restore part of it to put back. So, but I think transitional, it's a good term.
Frank, that's a really good point. I wonder among our panelists, how would you define or describe what the restorative part means in restorative justice? And again, I don't want to take that for granted, nor, but what's your any other perspectives?
A visual that comes to my mind is Humpty Dumpty. He fell off the wall kind of thing, but it's like you can't put it back together the same way. And there's cracks. There's a lot of cracks. And so there's going to be a semblance of wholeness, which I hate that term for being restored or that I'm not whole now, but for this conversation is that's kind of what first comes to mind for me, is that it's kind of a glue that can help you put some things back together, right? But it's still cracked. There's still, this harm was done there, unless there's some great miracle, which most of us never have. Life is lived a different way. But then you can go to some Middle Eastern cultures who say it's the broke and cracked that are the most beautiful. And maybe that is our gift to the church, back to the church. Mm-hmm. Is the witness of our journey, our faithfulness, our keeping on getting up and getting up and getting up, and also the strength it takes to just engage in something like this. I just kind of think of what my personal energy is every day, and then I'm like, when Jim asked me to do this, I'm like, yeah, okay, I will. And for various reasons, things going on in my life, I could say yes to it, but and so I think that I think the notion that restorative, like Frank was saying, is also, and we're back to this, the way God intended us on the day we were born to be, that innocent, beautiful person with all those gifts and talents. So much that was robbed from us, or even our development as children was robbed, depending on what kind of abuse. That is almost inhuman, unless to totally heal and revive and to live in that way. So those are my comments on that.
I think an analogy could be like a corporate, like here in Minnesota, we have the iron mining industry, and for years and years, the big steel companies came in, took the iron, went their way, and then left the big hole and stuff. And they polluted Lake Superior, they polluted the rivers, they polluted the lakes, and they simply had no accountability. They changed CEOs, and this guy came in, he said, well, it's not my problem, it was the other guys that did it. And they had to force them into some sort of put something back, clean up the lake, find someplace else. Dow Chemicals gone through this in several spots in the US. They had to come back in and clean that up. Was it ever going to be the same for those people? Is their water ever going to be quite the same? Is their community ever going to be quite the same? No. But they arrived at least at a mutually acceptable outcome. And that's the way I see that. Mm-hmm. So to restore would be say, I'm not happy, but I'm satisfied that we've done what we can do.
I'm not.
Yeah, thank you, Frank.
And I'm not sure if it fits, but I guess what comes to mind is not so much, again, building on what Anne Marie was saying, not so much to restore to the way you were at birth or something, but to say, how do you support someone to find their most authentic self? And to me, that means I've worked with victim survivors where they come forward and the narrative is pretty familiar. They're usually boys or men. They wait 25 years. They've done everything they can to not tell this story, drink, drug, get into confusing relationships, a whole range of things, anything to not have to tell their parents and not have to tell someone else. They've tried to pretend that they're okay going to church, and inside it's killing them to be in the church. And they've had to create a self that will fit in. But when they are ready to come forward, there's a whole process that takes time where I can see them unfold and kind of sort out the messiness of it all. So maybe they put that Humpty Dumpty together, and maybe it's not perfect, but it's authentic. It's, this is who I am. I'm going to go in this church as a victim survivor. I'm not interested in hiding anymore. I'm not interested in having a secret. I'm not interested in pretending. And I think there's some beauty in that personally, but I mean, even seeing you, Jim, I'm sitting here thinking of meeting you early on, and to think
Yes.
that you're sitting here today, 10 years later, and you're facilitating this, that's the
Yes.
gift to me of this work, is seeing the healing is possible
Mhm.
over time through support, not in isolation and not through shame,
Right.
so.
Right. Yeah, I think that the deepest harms, of course, is this deep betrayal of trust that perdures in all kinds of ways throughout people's lives, and that the restorative justice, an authentic beginning of restorative justice, is reason for hope, and that even that small piece, that little nugget of reason for hope, it can be transformative, and is worth all that's goes into a commitment to real restorative justice.
You can say it, Barbara, all the work.
Yeah.
All the work.
It is a lot of work.
There have been several comments, both in the chat as well as in the question. And those, they address, if you will, the theme of institutional denial or an abdication of responsible leadership within church life. And so for those of you who share those, you have named some specific people, but generally speaking, my impression is that you have a relatively low opinion or real concern about the notion of accountability, which has just been shared. My response to that, and then I would welcome the panel as well. My response to that is that people who do bad things never want to be found out. And in some cases, the folks to whom they have done that bad thing, they don't want to be found out either. So restorative justice from a victim-centered approach begins with an acknowledgement that something has happened to me and I need help. I want to talk about it, and I would like to again, pick your definition of restore. I would like to be restored to my authentic self, whatever that looks like today. But it's really important for me to remember that those other behaviors, however criminal, however institutional, however long-standing, however insidious, however you'd like to kind of characterize how bad it was, right? That there are mechanisms for dealing with that, but really, it is rare for an offender to be found out as an offender. And in many cases, let's just be really candid here, we're talking about folks who had years of their priestly career in abuse. I'd like to, I really appreciate what I, am hearing as, kind of some passion and some real responsiveness to leadership. And again, I would offer that you can omit those folks from restorative justice efforts. And I think, again, if we refer back to, what a victim-centered approach looks like, really ask the victim, what are you looking for? But thank you for those comments. And again, from the panel, any response, any additional response to that? There are a number of comments about folks who have left the pews, who have felt either that they have been themselves abandoned or that the degree of harm leaves them kind of unwilling. I mentioned in my opening comments that we would have a somewhat Catholic approach. And at this point, well, what do you say to those folks? Tom?
What do I say to the folks who are about the fact that people aren't coming back into the church? Excuse my cat.
Hi, cat.
Honestly, I don't know what to say other than I understand, personally. I mean, I look at it like when I talk to victim survivors, then I have to hear them and their experience, and then often their partners, their spouses' experience. and then hear that their children, once they learn, are saying, I don't want to have anything to do with this church, you know, and so it doesn't surprise me that people are struggling with their faith and showing up. You know, I guess, yeah.
Well,
Well,
and
there's an ecclesiastical culture that we've had to deal with. If you grew up like I did in the 1950s, and you knew that the nuns had told you that it was the ordained, and then the nuns, and then the married people, and then finally the single people at the bottom of the stack. But and you know that your mother and dad didn't do anything without checking with father. They opened up a can of pork and beans one Friday, and my God, you know how much pork was in those things? It didn't even worth talking about, but you had to call and see if it was okay that we could eat the pork and beans. Okay. We were indoctrinated into believing that those people were above us, and so were they. They will tell you that they were ontologically different, and because of that, there's no level playing field, never was one. I found it very difficult for this man who represented God in every sense of the world in my culture, told me to do these things. Well, how could this possibly be the sin? So tough to address any kind of healing when you know that there never was an equal playing field, and I'm not sure that they still see that. NCR just did an article on that about a week ago on the fact that that culture still exists. They don't have to. And one priest, this is close to an actual quote, he said, we've never learned that we had to apologize to lay people. We were never accountable to lay people, he said. We were accountable to the bishop. So the church being the lay people, boy, that says a lot.
And Frankie, I think I hear you referring as well to what I hear some people refer to as kind of the culture of clericalism. Again, that sense that there are, that there's a separate, separate expectations for priests.
I just wanted to add something to what Frank said, because I grew up in that same type of culture of, the priests were held to on a pedestal and all of this. But the one word that I keep thinking about a lot with this topic is, where's the humility and where's the shame? Like, I don't hear that as much. Like, there's a couple of priests that we work with to do the Master Open Healing. They're all about their humility. They're all about their shame. They're all about owning their shame about this happening from their brother priests. But I don't hear enough about that. I don't hear enough of the humility. I don't hear enough sadness even. Like, if I'm a priest, I'm thinking, oh my God, I feel so embarrassed and ashamed of the behaviors of my brother priests. But I just don't hear that as much.
And I wonder too if that isn't an example of what Frank was talking about. Again, a separate set of expectations, a different, maybe even a different reality in which folks operate. And I know that I've been a part of conversations where folks have said, when they get together, they meaning priests or leaders, diocese, what do they talk about? Because there are some pretty big topics out there that just don't appear to be part of that discussion.
Can I just add to that?
Please.
To actually just even go into answering the question a little bit, how do victims show up in the pews, right? I know part of my abuse was ritual abuse, so going to church is very triggering, and for some reason, I don't know how many years I was able to do that, but in the last 5 years, I've had anxiety or panic attacks when I've entered a church. I mean, so bad that I cannot be inside the church. And, but also I was raised in a very conservative, these are the rules, you go to mass on Sunday. And so I'm like, I can't have more guilt. So I'm wrestling with this, right? Because there's all of this going on inside you. And so I brought it to the Archbishop, and he was like, oh, I'll dispense you. You're free until you feel you can go. And it's a place where there's actually, you feel you're getting something from it. There's a gift, you don't go, and just take your time with that. And the freedom of that. And so maybe that's something you can encourage people to say is like, if that's still bothering you and it's still something you're psychologically working through, maybe go ask for that. That is something that, I wouldn't even thought to ask years ago. I wish I'd known to ask for that, but it's just maybe something for people to consider if that's something they're struggling with. There was something else I was going to say, but I totally forgot it. So
Anne Marie, when you mentioned that, when you kind of talk about that, I think about boundaries and how important boundaries are. Boundaries are important, of course, for priests, for community members, and for individuals who have been harmed, both acknowledging that boundaries have been crossed or violated, as well as establishing new boundaries, and hopefully in a really healthy and functional way. So your illustration that one boundary was to take this activity and to to not go and to have this mechanism for that. That's also really about self-care as well. And I think, as has been mentioned earlier, right, restorative justice is part of a healing, thereby therapeutic approach to addressing harm. And doing that, again, as Barbara said, requires some work. Doing that, as Tom said, requires being your authentic self. And as Frank and Anne Marie said, it also takes a great deal of determination, and in some cases, kind of fire to be able to do that. So again, I think with great investment comes great reward, but it is certainly true that it is work. Anne Marie.
It is, and I've been labeled by priests in our archdiocese who want to avoid this, or they feel, oh, poor me, because now I'm judged like all these priests who abused, and so it becomes about them again, right? And so that's a whole issue on its own. But oh, Jim, help me. What was I saying? I have a little memory loss. It's honest. Come by that honestly.
That's great. Actually, Emery, several folks have just made a couple of comments about this notion of, can you just ignore the past and move on, or could we just kind of leave this thing where it is and move on?
Yeah.
I've been told I'm difficult, and
Right.
that, Lord, leave the parish, please. We just don't want to deal with you. And so and I'm just like, oh no, you're in for a fight. And they're like Frank said, once you do that to me, I'm like, oh man, I'm going to be in your face. So I'm not sure that's healthy, but that's sometimes been my response, especially when it comes to clergy, is that that's not okay. And I'm not going to be the one to say that's okay.
Yeah, I think that the survivors have been so extraordinarily brave, particularly after many years, to come forward and to speak a terrible truth. And I think that the flip has not been so, meaning that the truth telling that needs to be reciprocal to that from the church, the radical transparency, the radical accountability, the full commitment to zero tolerance, all of those things have to be in place to create an environment of safety and trust that people who have left, people who have been worn out by it, will begin to have a sense that this church is serious and that time does matter, that there has to be an urgency about this, that I honestly, in my own naivete at the beginning of my own involvement with this in 2002, am astounded really 20 years later to still be looking for urgency, to still be looking for us, that's, as Tom talked about, that sense of shame, that this is totally antithetical to what we believe in, who we are as followers of Jesus Christ. And it is still just I am still I'm literally at a loss for words as we sit here today and are having this conversation. And I just, call upon all of us collectively as a church. The Pope is calling for the synod, a synodal conversation. I'm still trying to wrap my tongue around that new word. It doesn't come easily. And I'm still really sure what it is. But I do think it's about dialogue. I do think it's about this deep listening. And it needs to be transformational. And for me, it needs to happen urgently. I am so tired of people telling me, oh, the church is a big bureaucracy. It's, thousands of years old. It takes forever to, that's gotten really old. You know? And I just, it's a now moment. It's a now moment.
Let me ask as a follow-up question then. So what recommendation or what do you say to someone who shares or also feels impatient, either about change or about justice? What's your response to that?
To say you're not alone. And that is a tough thing when people begin to feel isolated and really do feel quite exhausted by it all and feel that no one is listening. And that silencing is just so, it's effective, right? It can be very, you do become silenced again but to reach out, whether it's Awake Milwaukee or the other groups that are out there, and SNAP and all of the organizations that have enabled people to know that they are not alone and that their voices do matter, and that they are beloved of God and beloved of this faith community.
Well, Barbara, I don't have a tattoo, but were I to get a tattoo, I would like it to read something like the statement you just made. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
It's a long process. I get different dates in my mind, but 2002, that was the beginning of it. No, it wasn't. How about with 1985 was the first real big deal, and I think
You're
it was
right, Jim.
1984, 85 that NCR did their first article on a national basis on sexual abuse. But in 2004, Bishop Wilton
Gregory?
Gregory from, I think, Atlanta at that time, he said, well, the sexual abuse crisis is pretty much over. That was 2004. And we've seen, and in 2002, the Dallas Charter, they said, well, we're zero tolerance. And no, they're not. It's ridiculous. So, but have we made progress? I think sometimes it's really easy to despair. Have we made progress? Yes, we've moved a long ways along that spectrum. Otherwise, we wouldn't be even having this today. This wasn't
Well, we
possible.
owe that to you, Frank, and to you, Jim, and to you, Anne-Marie, and all the survivors. You have been the light bearers and have brought us forward. Whatever this path that will continue, there's no going back, and we owe it to every survivor who has shown this light. Thank you.
Thanks, Barb.
Thank you, Barbara. Barbara, I think that notion of there's no going back is sometimes so when a victim survivor kind of, again, when they share that experience, when they share that harm, when they are willing to talk about that pain, that really, I think, is often the shining. That is, an epiphany. That is truth telling. And you're right, there really is no going back from that. And again, hopefully for folks, that is received as being, their truth. It is acknowledged for that pain. And again, whatever process, could be therapy, could be restorative justice, could be a legal process, could be an engagement in a canonical process, but that there is a process that is underway that will, again, contribute to their healing. There are a number of comments, by the way, in acknowledgement of our panelists for both their candor as well as sharing their truth and experience. And so let me just pass that along. There's a question, Tom, for you. Can you tell us what diocese or kind of where in the US restorative justice is being used to address clergy sexual abuse?
I don't know that I can speak to all of the dioceses, but I think if you look at the Charter for the Protection of Children and Youth, one of the roles of victim assistance coordinators is to focus on the healing and reconciliation of victims that come forward, or something to that effect. And I look at the way this office was structured by Ralph Bonacorsi, was one of the early thinkers in terms of victim assistance. And Ralph came out of restorative justice models. So I think conceptually, the idea of how do you respond to a victim survivor when they come forward, that moment is a part of it. When you think about what outreach can you make available to them, if it's therapy, if it's medications, if it's talking to someone in the church, that piece is part of the restorative justice. When there's this, idea of saying you'll continue to work with them even while they're suing the diocese, that leave that to the lawyers, focus on this piece of it. When there's a reconciliation and there's a chance to meet with the cardinal if they want to, that's a part of restorative justice. And the piece that I feel most excited about is, like when I was able to bring together a bunch of victim survivors that I talked to individually, and suddenly they came together and they were like, oh my God, I'm not alone. And then that energy just took off on its own. And they're like, let's start the Healing Voices. Oh, let's build on the Master of Hope and Healing. Oh, let's go and build and do something at the Healing Guard. I mean, and like Frank was saying, and Barbara was saying, I think this moment today is just like the culmination of victim survivors saying, we can support one another, whether the church fully is on board or not. We have one another, and we can we can find a path forward for ourselves. So I think that's one way I experience it in Chicago. I don't know. I think that's hopefully how other places are trying to go, what they're trying to do. I don't know that they're always successful. It depends, I think, on the leadership. Like, is the bishop on board with it? Fortunately, I've had, Cardinal Supich is very supportive of the work I do. So I'm lucky.
Yeah. Thank
And
you,
the
Tom.
SNAP organizations, we've been on this for almost 30 years now, and found out early on that almost all victims see themselves as alone. Never could believe this guy would do it to another person. And we found out, of course, that there's almost never a single victim. In some cases, they've gone into the hundreds. And what the people want to be is heard. And I facilitate a SNAP group, and Jim does a support group, and you might too, Tom. I don't know. And Henry, you've been on a lot of them. Those things allow us to come together and share. It's, you could say, somebody said, well, you guys are a bunch of AAs. In one respect, that's exactly what we are. We come and we share and we listen and we support. We can't fix, but I have seen lots of people that said, I benefited from this so much. And you almost wonder, from what? We haven't really done anything. We just got together and talked. Well, that works in a family. It works. This is our family. And that is it. Dialogue is just a key.
Yeah, thank you, Frank. There's a comment from someone who identifies as a victim assistance coordinator, and they say that they share that they have found in their experience that once mediation is over, and I presume they mean mediation within the diocese, the victim survivor moves on from victim assistance system. I don't think that's uncommon, and actually I think that in some ways that is wise, because when I think Walt, who answered the question about what a journey of healing or a restoration looks like, I know that it doesn't always go in one direction. I know it's not always forward. It's sometimes one step forward, two steps back. But I do think that it's important for each part of the process to do well what it is supposed to do. That includes mediation, that includes victim assistance, but then also for there to be other elements of that person's experience. Again, as has been reinforced, therapy, counseling, one-on-one work, I think is really key to that. That is how all people become. Or that is one way in which folks can facilitate becoming their authentic self. Certainly not the only way, but again, that it is a journey, and that it should be progressive. So thanks for the comment. A number of folks have shared experiences either in the chat or in the question, which really speak to a deep and a profound and a grievous harm that has been perpetrated by a priest onto another human being. And I know that in my own work, one of the things that I try to do is really just acknowledge that if an individual says that this is harm, then that's harm. And again, that's their truth, and you kind of go from there. And I think that restorative justice, when you're talking, this is something, for example, employed in high schools too, and school age kids. I mean, literally, you can be 8 years old and do this work, right? And there are lots of school counselors who are facilitating restorative justice efforts. I think the more grievous the harm, the more work, the more preparation, the more unpacking needs to go into a restorative justice effort. And again, I think in many cases where there are victims of clergy sexual abuse, it would not be appropriate for their offender to be part of that conversation. And again, this is where, substituted leadership, replaced, authority, or really just acknowledged but absented authority from a conversation, can be appropriate. So again, I think going back to an earlier observation, there are, kind of degrees of harm that only the individual determines for themselves, and that will speak to perhaps the amount of work or pre-work that needs to be done by a restorative justice session, which again, could be a one-time or an ongoing effort.
I think too, Jim, it also depends on the age the abuse happened. I look at a sister who was abused in her teens versus I was abused from 5 to 12 years old for years and years and years and years and multiple. So just having a familial, comparison, or how she copes, and she's a different person than me too, right? Versus me. So I love how you said each person is uniquely different. What is the harm? But it's also the age. There's so many things that go into that I think if you don't work into it, you can just make some predisposed or been a victim from some presuppositions, I guess I should say, about it. And so I love that you brought that up, and I think that's what the peace circles and some of the restorative justice things I have brought forward, is that even when you're sitting in those circles and you're listening to people's stories and their experience, and you hear the emotion come out, or even how they talk about it, if it's in a child's voice or if it's in more their teenage self. But what the common thread is that we understand each other. We understand the nature of the harm, and that we finally had a voice where other people understood us outside of our individual therapist, probably, right? So that was just something that came up to me as you were saying that was the experience I had that I was not expecting, and it was almost overwhelming to feel that companionship along my journey of fellow sojourners in the same thing. And there was a great sadness in that, but also really there's healing in that too. So it's such a mixed bag of things.
Thank you, Emery.
Thank you, Emery. There was also a comment about, or a question about whether or not restorative justice could be used as part of a healing process between secondary survivors, such as, parishioners, folks, as we mentioned earlier, who have, perhaps left the church, who are not directly abused. I think the answer is yes. Rather, I know the answer is yes. Is there anyone who would disagree or would like to kind of talk a little bit more about that?
We've never allowed people just to come in and listen for the heck of it, but we certainly encourage them to bring their caregiver or their support person or persons. It's really important for a lot of our people that their spouse is in on it. The spouse was in on the abuse, whether they liked it or not, because you simply don't know. The pebble in the pond analogy is the one I use. It's drop the pebble in the pond or the rock, and the hole heals very quickly. It's gone. Look at that. It's all gone. But the ripples go on and on and on. And who are they touching? What are they? You don't know. Every victim has a family, and those families have been victimized as well. So they're going to need some people with them to go on the journey. And if they've been on the hurting journey, they ought to be on the healing journey as well.
Yeah, I totally agree with Frank and Emery's comments about this. We worked extensively with parents of survivors, and had a parent group. And as many survivors have actually told me over the years, that one of the reasons at the time of when their own decision to come forward was often after their parents had died, because they could not bear the additional pain and suffering that they would experience, and that they knew their parent would experience in learning about the offender who was beloved by the whole family. But many, of course, parents just grieve the sense that they have somehow put their child in harm's way by encouraging them to be an altar server or a choir member, to answer the phone at the rectory, or go on that ski trip, or whatever it was. And it just was excruciating, because there's nothing that the primary mission of every parent in the universe is to protect their children, to keep their children safe. And it's just a crushing blow for many parents when they learn of even their adult children's sufferings because of abuse. So I totally affirm that this commitment to the entirety of those impacted families, parish members, and that goes out of how this impacts a parish. So it's so important.
Barbara, your comments are well directed. I am looking at the chat, and among the many, many attendees today, I know lots of folks, and I know that there are several parents who are just as you described. Thank you. I would like to go ahead and make a couple of closing comments, but in just the few minutes we have left, would any of you have anything to say?
Well, I think the American Council of Catholic Bishops have never been in our corner. I never felt that there any support from them at all. They verbalize, but there's no action. You can say that the only lists of abusers we've ever gotten, it seems like we're forced out of them by somebody filing a lawsuit, and they have fled into bankruptcy. What I want to see from the so-called the faithful, I want to see some sort of an insurrection. I want to see them demanding of their leaders, hey, you guys, and you can say guys in this case because there's no women up there, we want change. And you know what? We don't want you to change a law. Oh, we've got a new statute of limitations. We've got a policy on that. Quit changing the law. Change your heart.
And
change
Frank,
your ideas.
Yep. And Frank, what I hear from you is a reiteration, I think, of Barbara earlier's comment, which is, the time can be now, and that this is a moment. Panelists, let me first acknowledge that over the course of years and decades, many of you have been part of those moments. And so thank you. Let me also express my appreciation to all four of you for being candid, honest, raw, and prophetic during today's conversation. I really appreciate your perspective and your wisdom. And again, I can assure you from the questions and the chats, there has been lots of engagement. So thank you for facilitating that. Thank you also for giving hope to all of us in the words and in your deeds, in the activities that you've been a part of, and in the moments in which you have had to endure, I'm sure, a great deal of difficulty. Thank you for pushing forward. On a personal note, thank you to the many victim survivors who have shared their experiences with all of us, informing us, teaching us, trusting us to not hurt them yet again. A special note of appreciation to Julie Craven and Father Dan Griffith for their leadership and their collaboration with today's events. It has been a remarkable conversation. I have very much enjoyed spending the last hour and a half with you. I'd like to invite all of you to the next webinar on March 15th, entitled When the Practice Pivoted, Restorative Justice in the Digital Age. That panel will be moderated by our very own Julie Craven, the Associate Director of the Initiative for Restorative Justice and Healing. I thank all of you for your time, and I wish you a very good day. Thank you all.